So Michael works in the grant and fund and advisory part of Rocket Science. We have sort of two parts of the business. One is very much sort of Michael and his team. They're developing grants, they're administering grants, they're providing sort of funding and a grant advisory to other fund makers and other grant makers. My side of the business, we focus much more on evaluation research. But often, actually, what we find is that the two things very much align. And in order for sort of Michael and his team to start thinking about developing a new fund or working with a partner to understand what might be possible or what might be helpful, that actually it's a case of thinking about research as the sort of first main step. So what we'd always advise is right at the beginning, and for some of you this will be very obvious, but for some sort of smaller people, smaller organisations or people newer to the roles, this might not be as kind of clear. But from the beginning, you need to understand, well, what is the space in which I want to fund? What is kind of the landscape around me? And this could be you could be looking at a UK-wide fund, in which case it's a very specific theme. It could be a certain group of people. It could be quite place-based. We do lots of sort of place-based work, and it's understanding in a sort of neighbourhood setting what is happening, what's kind of out there, what are what could possibly be needed. There's three sort of key types of evidence that you might want to consider. The first is a literature review. So things happen. Academics in particular will be sat in universities and researching things. We have think tanks, we have organisations doing their own work and developing sort of reports and more great literature. And it's about understanding, well, what is happening now? What do we know about this topic? What is best practice? Where are the gaps? Where are, this thing's happening, but nobody knows why, or this thing isn't happening, or this group's not being served. And it's really just trying to delve into almost what other people have said to go, well, is there an obvious gap or is there a need that needs to be filled? Alongside that, you should also be looking at a more sort of systematic approach to conducting a needs analysis. So here is kind of going beyond the maybe thematic areas that a literature review might focus on. So it might be quite abstract almost. And it's really focusing down to the specific nature of what you're looking at. Kind of this is the numbers. It's your public data review. It's what does the ONS say? What does the local authority say? What does a specialist organisation that's been collecting data say? And again, it's trying to understand, well, what might the needs of a population or a community or a group or a theme be? And what are the gaps? Where are these needs currently not being sort of satisfied? Often, what you find is that the public data is not great. Where there is 100% public data and you can see everything in it, usually that means there's been a lot of kind of work done. So where there's not enough to do your sort of public data review for that needs analysis, then we'd advise doing a sort of consultation exercise, collecting new data effectively. Something that can be really, really important here, and particularly for funding programs that are trying to help sort of some of the hardest to reach or the kind of least engaged in society, or those that perhaps face kind of multiple axes of deprivation. It can be the case that as a sort of funding organisation going into a local area, into a community group, people might not want to speak to you. So you can use things such as peer research, where you can train up sort of people with lived experience to go out and do some of that consultation work. But I think what's really key here is just making sure that it's meaningful. And I think, you can often hear of consultancy going out and asking 10 people one question and then coming back and creating a £2 million approach. It's trying to just make sure that it's sort of a bit slower, meaningful, and really is engaging those people with lived experience. And then the other kind of sort of evidence review you might want to do is more around this asset and systems mapping. So it's not just then thinking about what's the theory or what's the sort of data, but it's going, well, what actually exists in this space? So here we're really thinking about assets. So that could be buildings, that could be other programs, other projects ongoing. It's also the connections between things as well. So how together is the system? How much does the system work together? If it's a big gap, then maybe it's the case that actually in this area, people are being supported in the right ways according to the literature. There's no real gaps in terms of groups, but actually it's that the system's not working together, and it might highlight ways that you want to develop a fund that can address those system gaps. So it's just kind of a bit of a flavour of the things that you want to think about and the kind of key methods you can use to do it. But it is just sort of saying in that real beginning step, before you've even thought about what your fund's going to be called, is just reviewing what else is out and about in that landscape.
Great. Okay. And then the next area really is sort of thinking about your place within the ecosystem, so within the funding ecosystem itself. And really, there are three, so three key areas to consider, here. So the first is around the funding flow analysis, and what that means really is about understanding who's in the space, where's the money flowing from and to. So who the funders are, is it around government money? Is it about independent foundations or organizations that are set up to filter funds and to then start looking at what they're supporting. So where's that going? What sort of organizations are being supported? What's the priorities of those? Because by doing that, you can then sort of see what your niche is. Why are you creating a program to fill this sort of gap or this additionality? And what you don't want to do necessarily is that you sort of go ahead and just keep doing what you're doing, and then someone else comes into the space will find that need isn't necessarily there. So is it actually making the most impact? An example could be something like physical sport in London, where there's going to be some large funders like Sport England, funding in that space. There's going to be London Marathon, there's going to be London Sport. There's a 20 million program called Go London, which is set up as well, within the GLA and others. So there's quite a lot going on, and it's sort of then trying to think, well, actually, what if we were going to fund similar things? Is it about trying to reach into smaller groups, larger groups? Is it trying to do perhaps a different approach or look at innovation? Is it trying to do something different because there's a lot of funding going on in that space, for example? Then you sort of come on to stakeholder consultation. So really about connecting with other funders to understand where best placed to add the value and impact. So it's about then having discussions, looking at, perhaps talking to other stakeholders, including, perhaps previous grantees or applicants or charity leaders or people with lived experience around, the sort of areas that you're looking to support, and really trying to understand what the real need is. Is it still the same, or has it shifted a little bit here because of policy or other things that have come in? So the question is really around that. How do you know that you're really making the best, the most impact and the most sort of value that you can? And, really it's around those sort of challenges and trends and how you can sort of overcome those and build that into your sort of offer, really, as being, an investment of money to really make a real significant difference. And the third is really around that facilitation and partnership development. So it could be around pooled funding, for example. So if there are others, as that example I gave earlier, you could think, well, okay, perhaps what we do is then talk to these organizations and maybe we could do something together, which becomes a bit more meaningful, that you're asking applicants to just go through one process rather than several for the same sort of pot of money, really. And we've seen that with Go London, which is a consortium of funders, and also with Propel and London funders as well. Or it could be about how to complement each other or just cross-refer, applications as they come through. So it could work really well, but it's just trying to, again, just sort of make sure that you're aware of all those sort of different moving parts within the space. Okay, and I think this is you, Maddie, again, just coming back to you.
Yeah, of course. So you just got the next slide, please, Michael. Perfect. So then when you've sort of understood what's kind of the gap, what could your fund focus on, and you've figured out where your sort of place is within that system, what other funders might be doing and how you can sort of best complement it, you're then getting closer to the stage of starting to think about the sort of nuts and bolts of it. But what we'd always recommend before you dive into the sort of detailed design is just stepping back a bit and going, right, who are we as an organization, and what do we actually want to achieve? Because there are lots and lots and lots of ways you can address or develop a fund that would address social challenges. And there is a sort of importance for you organisationally in making sure that aligns with kind of where you come from, what your board or what your trustees are sort of assuming that the organisation is going to push forwards. So we always recommend going to look at your sort of long-term goals, your mission, your purpose. Most kind of bigger funders would have this. Organizations that are just setting up is something that you should probably think about early on. And when you know what you want to do, so what is the be all thing that you want to be known for? What is that one thing that you want to help address or alleviate or improve or whatever it might be? Then it's thinking, well, rolling back a bit from that. Okay, so this is what I want to be. Here's the challenges in the space that I'm going to work in. and how can you sort of match those two up? So how can you kind of move from the end goal, step backwards, and understand what sort of activities or what kind of approaches you could take? So a key part of this is starting to almost sketch out some of the impacts and the outcomes that you want or that need to happen in order for you to achieve your sort of longer term mission. What we sort of recommend, and hopefully this term isn't new for most people in the room, but is a theory of change. So anyone that's not heard of it, a theory of change is effectively quite a simple sort of visual approach that shows all the components of a project or a program or an organization. And basically, it's your journey. How do you get from we have staff time and money and resources to the ultimate outcome, which might want to be we want people to live healthier, happier lives, as is kind of rocket sciences. So it's just thinking about, well, we know what we're putting in, we know what we want to see out, how do we match up the middle bit? And like I said, developing a theory of change can be really, really important if you haven't already got one for your organisation. And if you do have one, then definitely go to it and really understand where your potential project could fit. Next slide, please, Michael. And this really, really helps you to think about the impact early on. So by thinking from the very beginning, well, what is the visual story of the impact? I want to see this happen and this happen and this happen for this to happen. Again, you can start fleshing out what some of the middle points need to be. It can also help to identify links between complex programs of activities. So if you have one for your organization, you could have 10 different funding streams going, and you can use a theory of change to understand how these connect together and to understand how streams A, B, and C maybe work together towards similar outcomes, but C also works together with F. And you can start really understanding are there any outcomes that are being underserved? And maybe that's again where you want to focus some of your efforts. They're also really useful to consider on an ongoing basis because you can test your thinking as you go. So when you've got one and things sort of get mobilized, you can go back to this and use it as a little bit of a sort of reflection point. And you can also update them, and you should indeed, to reflect on sort of changes and what's happening. But the key thing is that having one of these can really just help further sort of guide you through that early stage and thinking about how do we sort of develop an impact-driven grants program. Back to you, Michael.
Great, thank you, Maddie. Okay, and this fourth section is about your really, we've got your approach, how you then design and deliver a program. So it's really the nuts and bolts to, you know, as Maddie was saying, you've done this sort of thinking, the landscaping, you've sort of worked out what your priorities are, you know, what you're really wanting the program to really achieve, and the objectives are clear. You know, you're then sort of then interpreting that into a you know, a program. So, you know, the next thing really is to sort of think about, you know, how to design that. And certainly you've probably all come across this, but I think it's probably worth having a refresh, because certainly when we're advising, you know, funders on how to build programs, and you know, they've got various questions in there, you know, a lot of this actually comes into play where, you know, there are these sort of funder commitments. So the Institute of Voluntary Action Research, IVAR, they have these 8 funder flexible funder commitments, and each of them really, it's about sort of trying to, you know, from a funder's perspective, just try to hold yourselves to account a little bit and think about how you can be more accessible, how you can, you know, be transparent, trusting, and having that sort of open, you know, that openness really with applicants and grantees. So each of these has its own place, and if you want to, you know, we can talk more about this obviously when we start thinking about the deeper dive session, but you know, it's really just holding you to account to sort of think, you know, are you really being as flexible as you can? Are you taking the risks? Because at the end of the day, you know, making a grant is a gift. You know, it's not supposed to have lots of all these rigor around it about, you know, about things, you know, it's too risky, or it's not. It is about taking some risks. So it's about, well, how far, you know, how adverse, you know, is the trustee board, you know, how far would they want to go in terms of taking risk, and how particularly you can be proportionate around, you know, what you're doing, and certainly the questions that are being asked and the monitoring that's coming through. Now, sort of talking about the actual design elements here. So I think about, personally, you know, I'm quite passionate about the designing of the program. I think if you design it well and it's been well thought through and developed, then it should be successful. I think those that probably don't tend to be too successful, normally those that are either done in phases, because sometimes we're sort of against it with time, and we'll sort of like launch a program because there's a deadline, and later on we'll think about the monitoring or how we'll assess it. That's where the challenges come in, or where it's just something which has been done before, and it's just, well, we're going to continue to do this without actually really reflecting or reviewing what's working and what isn't. So I think, if you do it the right way, I think it's really quite a critical piece of the puzzle, really. So throughout designing a program, I would say, you should take that sort of applicant lens, always look at it from the applicant journey. And if you follow that through, you can see what's working, what isn't, and what perhaps, becomes more of a barrier, an obstacle for the applicant. Certainly using plain English, so trying to stay away from using jargon, and making sure you have short sentences that are very simple and straightforward. We also need to understand it's not necessarily the applicant's first language, so I think that's something that we should all give consideration to, and then sort of thinking about accessibility, improving the accessibility through the design. It is sort of thinking about how are you going to really sort of implement this, and normally it would be through a system, but there will be some challenges for some people, and it could be there are barriers because of disability, it could be about language, could be there's other challenges, and what sort of, I suppose, what vehicles do you have if they can't follow this this mainstream process? What other alternatives are there? So normally, you could probably think about, perhaps could they send a video in? It'd probably be a small handful of applicants that will probably go through this route, but there may be some that will need to do sort of other routes. So yeah, video is perhaps one option, perhaps meeting with the applicant or having a conversation with them online, looking at how they can perhaps submit it in another format. We have a couple of examples with some clients where we've actually had a small access fund, and what we've allowed them to do is where they have had challenges such as interpreters that are required. They can so they can use a translator, and we could probably give them up to £500, for example, to help them with their application. So there may be opportunities where you can think of alternatives like that may be able to help them through the process to apply. Other situations may be that perhaps they don't meet the threshold of your criteria, and what you could do is think about whether you could use a sponsor, so they could perhaps apply under a larger organisation that does meet your criteria, and is there an option to do that? Or perhaps think about more of a collaborative approach where they're working with others, and the other organisations again would sort of be large enough to sort of meet your threshold. I think also being sort of open and transparent as well, so that having things like eligibility quizzes, because for some organisations they would probably think that, and I've seen it with some funders, they see it's like a numbers game. The more applications that come in, the better. And that's not really the way. It's about having an eligibility quiz to try and ensure that applicants have read the guidance. They have thought about whether or not they should be applying. And as they go through the process, it's then thinking, okay, through the eligibility quiz, you're really shutting them down earlier on to make sure they don't progress, because the last thing you want is an organisation that's not going to go anywhere because they just perhaps haven't got the right legal setup, or they're too small or too large. You don't want them sort of jumping through all the hoops and applying, where as soon as you see it, you say, well, that's a no, because they just haven't met the basic criteria. So it's about trying to set those sort of barriers where they're not progressing if they haven't read the criteria. And I would say in some cases that is always the case. They don't always read that. And that sort of comes on to the next point about not wasting time. So you're thinking it's not wasting your time, but it's not equally wasting the applicant's time if you have these things in place. So they're positive rather than a negative sort of way forward. And I think always asking why as well. So as you're working through the questions and you're working through the building of the form, or you're reviewing what you've done already, then always ask why. Why are you asking that particular question? What relevance does it have, and how you're using it through the process? If you're not, then there's probably a question there to ask as to whether it should be in the form, whether you should be taking that out. And as we go through the process here, the first thing to do really is about reviewing. If you have an existing program, what did you learn from that? So what worked well, what didn't work well, what could be improved? Again, an example may be thinking about our work is that, we work with the London Violence Reduction Unit, and they decided that they wanted to sort of change things and work a bit differently. So they've been having this program called, well, we've ended up calling it the Stronger Futures program. It was about sort of after school provision across London, and they decided to sort of rip up the grant making book that they had and said, let's do things differently. So that enabled us to sort of do something about a refresh and to do all the things that Maddie mentioned earlier. And through all of that, we decided, look, the prospectus needs to be easier, it needs to be lighter, it needs to have some visuals in there, it needs to be clearer. We also decided that we would move from application forms where we had one basic sort of registration form, but then we moved, instead of shortlisting, we moved to actually having interviews or discussions with shortlisted applicants. And that sort of broke down barriers because it enabled the decision makers to actually be visual on an online call with the charities that were applying. And it breaks down those barriers where you don't have to be have a brilliant sort of comms team to write applications. It's about being able to just talk really about what it is you're trying to achieve, and I think very quickly you can understand whether or not an organization is going to be successful and whether they understand or whether they're trusted in their communities and understand what the problems are. That can come across very quickly in half an hour of a discussion. So as that was happening, they were actually scoring the organizations through the same steps. So it's the same way as an application, but it was more of a visual discussion. So that enabled them to make more informed decisions. It was a bit more of a light bulb moment for them. And that enabled us to sort of reach these organizations they hadn't heard of before. And sometimes it's also about do you need to work with other people, other organizations? If we're trying to reach particular communities or particular type of thematical areas, we may need to work with partners to reach those communities. So it's just trying to sort of understand the parts that need to be played within that design. As we move into the sort of second section here, we can then sort of think about governance. So it's about, the structures that you have to make the decisions. So your boards of trustees normally, and whether there are sort of conflicts of interest and declarations in place, because you want it all to be transparent. The whole process should be transparent. Also, if you're making small grants, does it have to go through a board of trustees, or does your governing documents allow for things like delegated authority, where you could probably speed the process up a little bit and it can be sort of delegated to another person? So there are sort of things that could be changed or thought about through that process, and about the perhaps the experience of the decision makers as well. So because they're trustees doesn't mean necessarily they're the right people. They're obviously the people that decide where the money goes, but maybe just doing a skills analysis of those trustees to understand, does it really give a blended or like a 360 approach of an application? Ideally you want to bring in some lived experience. You perhaps want to think about whether you've got a geographical reach, someone that understands what's going on in those communities, perhaps someone with a financial lens and someone perhaps with a thematical lens. I don't know, but you need to think about the wider picture, and actually are they all complementing each other? If not, perhaps there's an opportunity to bring in some of those people to help with those decisions as well. And equally, as you're going through, below that, you then need to think about the moderation process. So as you're reviewing applications, who's going to review them and who's going to move them, who has the authority to really move those long lists to a short list, and finally provide that final portfolio to those decision makers. You may find as well within your governing documents, you may only be able to fund certain legal forms as well. So going back to your legal document may be useful just to understand what it is you can and can't do. And there has been a shift over the years of people moving away from just funding charities to funding KICs. So looking at community interest companies, perhaps looking at other approaches as well with organisations that are non-profit but are limited by a guarantee, for example. You then think about the prospectus. So once you've got all of that, you then think about telling the world really about what your program is, and trying to be short, trying to be sharp with what it is that you're attempting to do with the program, and what your eligibility is, what the exclusions are. And I did see one a while ago, I won't mention who, but it was about 85 pages long. And we did go back to them and say, look, this is really quite difficult, because when you look at it from an applicant's perspective, they're not going to read 85 pages. You could have that perhaps as a separate document, but what they really want to do is sort of look at something and say, right, what's the program doing? What's it set up to achieve? What are the priorities? What are the exclusions? What can be funded? Perhaps, how much can I apply for? Where are the timelines? And perhaps, there's a link to applying, where do I go? that's probably the main things they want to see. So I think, trying to cover those earlier on, and then as you get perhaps towards the end, you can always have appendices or supplementary documents that talk perhaps about the research of why the program was set up, but really it's about trying to give the applicant as much as they need up front so they can make that informed decision as to whether to go further or not. Monitoring the valuation as well. So as you start thinking about monitoring the valuation, what do you need to know? What questions would you build into an application form to help understand the sort of benchmarking of what you're recording and value for money, etc. So there's all these additional questions you may want to capture which you need to think earlier on. And particularly if you're looking at demonstrating impact or looking at social return on investment later, there may be certain questions or certain KPIs or indicators that you may want to capture at that earlier stage. So it's trying to think through all of that so you have it within an application and it's very clear, concise, and you're ready to then run with that. And I would say as you start working through an application form, what you're really trying to judge is firstly probably about how good are they. So when they start coming in, it's about are they any good? So that's like your long list, and then your short list is how good are they. So you need to be able to sort of ensure that the questions you're asking will enable you to answer all those questions and enable you to shortlist and to go through your assessment. What you don't want is to sort of do it in stages and you get to an assessment and go, I wish I put that question in, and it's sort of too late because you've already launched it. And then I could probably go on forever here. There's sort of things like priorities. So how you think about priorities. Are there certain interventions, themes, types of groups that you're supporting? Are there certain boroughs? So again, you probably want applicants to start selecting these, because as you start collecting your portfolio and your list and you're starting to look at a complementary portfolio, you're going to want to sort of see that breakdown and look at how you can cut the portfolio to have a good sort of balanced reach across all of those different themes. So I think that is really important, and certainly when you start thinking about your assessment framework, then that's where it all comes together, where you're taking those questions, you're able to interpret those into whether it's a score, whether it's a RAG rating, there's maybe weighting on some of that. So it's about how you collect all of that. And again, perhaps at the same time, collect some feedback about what the weaknesses are. And we're starting to do that because that enables us to then quickly give some, some tailored responses to those that are unsuccessful later on. And probably lastly to talk about it is two things here. One's about due diligence. So we do encourage funders to do due diligence towards the end. So once they're quite likely to support a group of applicants, then that's probably the stage to run some due diligence, because I think you're not then putting the onus on the organisation to provide too much additional information on something which actually isn't going to go anywhere. There are still some funders that will do it right at the beginning, and I don't think that's probably the right way, because you're sort of setting people up to fail a little bit by asking them to provide all these policies and bank statements and all sorts of things where you may not be supporting them. And really, for me, I would think due diligence is something which it is more that you are going to probably support them, but if they don't perhaps meet certain policy standards, then it's more about term and condition which enables them to do that over the next sort of couple of months or whatever it might be. So I would probably suggest it's a smaller number of applicants. So to think about what it is and what's your appetite to risk and what is your due diligence process. And then lastly, we're sort of thinking about comms and systems. So how you're communicating those outcomes, what stages are you going to tell people they're successful or not? What is the outreach and promotional opportunities, and how you can work with your panel and sort of other members to really sort of disseminate, the information about the program. Lastly, here's about the systems. So particularly within local authorities, a lot of local authorities that still use Word and spreadsheets. And, for us, it's about trying to sort of provide more efficient systems. So end-to-end systems, grant systems, make the process much easier, where you can have the sophistication of online application portals with eligibility quizzes, with word counts, with required fields, etc. And it basically enables all of that information to come into a system. You can do all your assessments in the system and communicate the outcomes and manage all the monitoring and evaluation as well. So different funders will do different things. I mean, we use Blackboard, but there will be others like Salesforce and Plinth that others use as well. So we can tailor approaches for particular clients. Okay, and let's move on to the next slide. There's enough on that one. And here's some examples. So this was like with the financial reduction unit, and we sort of ran their prospectus. This is like a couple of pages I took off of the prospectus. So it's just trying to make it a bit more easier on the eye, really, that we're talking on the left-hand side about what the program is about, who the London Violence Reduction Unit are, talking about their particular strategies and what their aims are, what the priority areas are. And then on the right was more just a flow diagram that we thought would put together that worked really well. It did sort of, it was well received, which sort of just ran through the steps of the program. So you're going through from stage 1, which is about the eligibility, right through to decision on stage 5. There were dates with this as well, but it's just talking about these are the pathways really that you would follow, if you were to apply. So it's trying to be really clear, and rather than having lots of text, it was just trying to break it down a little bit into more of a visual. Okay, and then as we start going through delivery of a program, I'll try to be shorter here, is all a bit of time, but the first one was about engaging applicants. So it's very important, I think, to do sort of market warming, to think about how you're going to reach these audiences, because you can have it on your website, you can put it on your social media. It doesn't necessarily mean it gets to the right people. So it's sort of understanding, as I said before, are there particular organisations you could work with. So, for example, when we try to reach community-led organisations in London, we work with Action for Race Equality, ARE. So they sort of enabled, further reach into communities and enabled us to we had our own networks, but obviously, they have their own as well. So it's just trying to think about, are there others that can help get the message out, really? And within that, about how you can use social media, how you can then think about information sessions. So trying to draw in online, and I think face-to-face works well as well. I think they have different outcomes, but certainly be able to talk to people about what it is that you're trying to achieve, what the program's set up to do, and having those sessions. I mean, maybe I would say between 2 and 4 would be really useful. I think sometimes online has a place where people just don't have the time, and I think sharing a little bit of, I can spend half an hour on a call works really well. I think sometimes the face-to-face, some people would like that because they can network afterwards as well. So I think, it's about how you can do that, how you can then manage queries that come through. So how can you do that? Is it through email? Is it through a telephone support? Is it through having virtual conversations on Teams or Zoom? Do you have surgery sessions where you may perhaps be in a particular community, for example? So there are things you can do to try and help people to decide whether or not to apply, and to help them through any challenges they may face. And then as you start working through the managing applications, this is where you're sort of really just screening and going through, those that have come through, do they really fit the criteria, or have they just gone back and changed the answers? So it's about trying to make sure the right people are coming through, creating that long list. And, again, is at a point where you then communicate to those that haven't been successful or not, and making sure you're meeting all your published deadlines in your prospectus as well. And then as we work right through here, we're talking about assessment and decision making. So just ensuring that what you provide to your panel, I guess, sometimes I've heard that what is provided, sometimes it's very similar, and sometimes it can be quite different. And I think there are some alarm bells if it's quite different, because I think that means that you're scoring, your assessment, the processes that you're going through are perhaps a little bit disjointed from what the decision-making process is, and perhaps those that are in the room making those choices are perhaps thinking of something different. So sometimes it's good to perhaps just have a conversation about that and understand why, and make some tweaks there, because if they're slightly different, that's fine. There will be things that move around a little bit, but if it's quite vastly different, then I think I would probably raise some questions around that, about why that's happening. And particularly due diligence, and again, the application forms, making it proportional. I think proportional due diligence is important. Again, these can be terms and conditions, but it's about protecting yourself as a funder, but also protecting the charity. Hence why you ask for things like insurance, what the insurance policies are, because you want to make sure if any claims happen, they are still in existence, and it's a claim to the insurance, not it's a claim against the organisation. And so when I mentioned earlier on just about that constructive feedback as well, so how you can be constructive in that, and if you are providing additional support beyond money, where it's perhaps capacity building, it's perhaps some training, then there's a question about, is that just for grantees, or could you open that up to some of these that you're not supporting, which sort of, lowers the response, that it's not, you're unsuccessful. It's that actually, you haven't been successful here, but maybe there's access to something which might help. If you're doing a one-to-many approach, it doesn't really matter how many people are on the call necessarily. And then lastly, as we come through, we think about mobilisation. So within this section here, we're talking about things like phased payments. So we'd suggest obviously trying to give some funding in advance. I think trying to improve the cash flows of these organisations so they can focus on the delivery of the work is certainly something that we've learned through COVID, and suggested to most funders is that they do front end some of that funding, but again phase it on the monitoring. To have an induction meeting. So talk to all the organisations, bring them all together. It could be in a room, it could be online, but I think it's important to bring them all together to talk about, what the processes are, make them feel part of the programme and part of your fund, so they sort of understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and it all feels like it's a relational relationship there, not transactional. That's what we're trying to get away from. And then sort of how you work with grantees to raise the programme, so how they can perhaps use social media or their own networks to help talk about what you're doing, and equally, position you as well to help raise their own profile for future funding as well. And then lastly, as they're starting to gather insights and data that comes through the monitoring, then trying to understand how you can help them to perhaps overcome some of those challenges. It isn't about right or wrong. It used to be 10, 20 years ago, that if you weren't doing something correctly, it was like, oh, we're going to get a red flag. But it's about trying to help and work with them. So if you can spot something that's not working, it's about having a conversation and honest discussion with them about how you can help them to perhaps change some of the milestones, or is there something that could be done differently to help them to overcome some of those barriers. And then for them to understand what's happening to this data. So where it's going into dashboards, it's becoming part of your your KPIs, or perhaps your research papers, or something that's going to perhaps think about your strategy or future programs, then to let them know, that's what the purpose is. Because last thing you want to do is provide all this data and you're giving all this information, but you don't know how it's being used. I think if you understand how it's being used, you're more inclined to give the data, and also to have things like site visits. And we'll talk about communities of practice shortly, but bringing all that together helps you to then really get the insights of what's happening on the ground. And certainly site visits, you can really sort of just get to meet organisations and meet how they're delivering their programs, which is so much better than these reports that come in on paper. So I'd probably recommend, there are things to consider. Maddie.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. So yeah, just quickly go through the last sort of 2 points in our cycle then. So first of all, really building on what Michael's just been saying, is thinking about what tools and processes might actually be helpful to help both you and your grantees learn and co-design together. And I think for this is a key thing, what Michael was just saying towards the end there, is that maybe in the past, funding was more around, you've set out to do this, you haven't, and having a stern conversation. I think increasingly what we're seeing, and what is really, really good for the sector, is this kind of turn and commitment towards learning, and that actually not everything you fund can go well, and sometimes the lessons about what really doesn't work are just as valuable for you as a funding organisation to take forwards and to shape other funds and other approaches. And as we'll reveal very shortly, this is very much a cycle. You get to the end and then you feed back into the beginning and start rethinking how you can further improve that grant making. So there are 4 sort of key approaches or key tools that you could be using. We recommend using all 4, and that each one will get something a little bit different. And each one of these as well, they do overlap, and there is sort of similarities between them. But we've tried to set them out in this way because hopefully it helps you understand where the differences might be and what the different value of each one is. So first of all is having bespoke monitoring templates. Now we've used the words bespoke and template in a sentence. Might seem weird, but there's definite sort of method to this. First of all, a template is useful because you can give that out to all of your fundees, all of your sort of grant holders, and they can adapt it to their own sort of specific realities. But fundamentally, you are collecting some kind of consistent data across the fund. But they should be bespoke, because if you just have one monitoring template for your whole organisation and for every single possible grant or fund that you have, then you're very quickly, as Michael was saying earlier, going to start collecting information that's not needed. It's going to be disproportionate, and it's going to take your grant holders and your fund holders a lot longer, more effort, more stress, whatever it might be, to collect it. So it's making sure that for each program of sort of funding that is going, there is its own bespoke monitoring form, but that itself, that is a bit of a template that can be adapted and flexed by the individual grant holders, so that they can go, oh, well, actually, we collect this extra data that's useful, and they're not stopped from doing that, but that you are getting that sort of level of consistency. Again, it's important that these are proportional. We've seen, I did some research earlier this year for a local authority. They just wanted to find out why people weren't applying for their grant. And the main answer is it's £3,000. We don't want to spend 2 days filling out your monitoring form. They just didn't see it was worth it. Turned out that much information didn't need to be monitored, can very, very quickly change the whole monitoring form to it's now 5 questions that you fill out once, and suddenly applications have increased again for the grant. The next element is very much about evaluation and learning. So there's so many different ways we can take this, but fundamentally it's throughout understanding, can we capture some of those impacts, which probably go beyond your monitoring form, and can we sort of develop some learning and insight from them as well. So we always recommend doing both an impact and a process evaluation. So understanding how much something's working, your impacts, but also how it's working. What are the mechanisms? What are the processes that lead to success or to failure? Because again, if things don't work, you know to avoid them in the future. The last two are a little bit more active. So you can just look at monitoring, evaluation, learning quite retrospectively. So you give people money and off you go, and then you're collecting your sort of forms at the end. If you want to, if you are sort of piloting something and it's trying to do something new, we really recommend a more action learning approach, wherein you're not holding people to what they promised right at the beginning. And as long as they're developing their own learning and insight and go to you, oh, this isn't working and this is why, that they have flexibility to adapt and not just keep pushing down. And I think the reason this is really important is I've worked on big sort of, national DFE funded projects, which have been pilots, and the pilot sites have been terrified of telling the DFE when things aren't going wrong because they're worried the funding will go. That wasn't the case. The DFE really wanted the test and learn, but they hadn't set up that culture of having that test and learn. They hadn't explained to people what it meant to fail, and that they didn't mind, and that they wanted that insight. So it's just about being quite active with that. And I think a key way that can be achieved is with a community of practice or a community of learning. And, say you've got a 3-year grant and there's 20 pilots across the UK, meet up once a month for an hour online and have slightly themed sessions, how's this bit going, how's this bit going, but hand it really back over to the grant holders, and let them learn from one another, and let them understand, okay, that thing's going wrong for them, it's going wrong for me as well. Oh, but they're doing a bit better. How can I learn from them? And by doing that, what you'll find is that the impacts that you're trying to measure through your monitoring and your evaluation, they will improve as things go on, because actually you're building in that learning, and you're building in sort of continuous improvement as you go. And then very finally, to the last part of our approach, thank you, is thinking about how you can effectively communicate your impact. So assuming now that you've designed your grant, people have applied for it, they've been running it, they've been collecting data, giving you data back. You might have been doing some site visits and things to collect extra data too. And it's then, what do we do with it all? So you're going to have some reach and outcomes analysis. There is going to be numbers and data that you can kind of crunch. It's always nice to be able to say this grant has helped 2,000 people achieve this outcome, and really try and distill things down, going back to that theory of change in sort of quite simple and kind of basic terms. But you also want that kind of more impact reporting, that story, that narrative, that, okay, well, here is a hard outcome, but what does that mean? What does that look like in the world? We've dropped in the ocean. How is that kind of rippling out and affecting other areas? A key thing here can be looking at social return on investment. So if you collect good data, particularly from the monitoring, you can start ascribing values, kind of economic values, to some of the outcomes and some of the work, and that can really help build up the picture. The very final thing, and then I promise we'll stop and we'll have a few questions, is just really considering about the multi-audience dissemination and discussion. So you don't just want to feed it back to one person. You probably want to feed it back to other funders, maybe to decision makers, kind of on a government or sort of regional or local level. It's also going to be to your thought makers, so to think tanks, to academics, but then very much to the fund holders, to the people that have had this, what's gone well, where have they sort of sat within it, and then very obviously to the people that the funds are impacting as well. So having kind of public friendly outputs, videos, infographics, whatever that might be, is really, really important just to show people what your organization is doing in ways that make sense to different types of stakeholders, audiences, etc., that you might have. Final slide, please, Michael. So this is our grant making cycle, which effectively is just the 6 sections that we've gone through today. As I've just put in chat, we will make sure this is sort of sent around, so you'll have our slides and you'll have this little cycle as well. Not every project might need as much sort of attention in each of the sections, but I think what we just really, really like people to take away from is the fact that it is a cycle. So you get to the end, you've communicated things out, you've understood what it is, and then you go back and now you're part of the evidence, you're part of the literature review, but you then start thinking, right, have we not done enough and we need to keep doing it? Do we need to just do this again? Do we need to tweak it? Or, yeah, actually, we've made a really good impact. Let's move to something sort of adjacent and kind of keep going that way. So I'll pause there. Michael, I don't know if you've got any final words just while we ask for any questions.
No, I think that's been quite a lot we've gone through. I think it's useful to probably reflect on this, and then to, if you are interested, I think there's obviously these deeper sessions that will be happening as well over the next few weeks. But this is just to give you a flavour really of everything that goes on within that cycle. So I hope it's been useful.